Look at this video. When you do, then you will know things like biodiversity and how important it is to bees.
Hey Braves, today we're talking about biodiversity. Biodiversity is simply many different types of life. So bio means life and diversity means many types. So you put those two together and we're talking about many different types of life in a given ecosystem. That's what biodiversity means. And there are two different types of biodiversity that we're mainly going to focus on. Genetic biodiversity, which is the number of different types of genomes within a given population. Basically, you don't want everybody being a clone of each other. You want a good mix of DNA in any given population so that should a disease or something come along, and your population doesn't get completely wiped out. The other type of biodiversity that we're going to talk about and study is species biodiversity. And species biodiversity is just as important as genetic biodiversity. And let's go on ahead and get into that. You guys probably notice I'm standing right here in front of this soybean field. And this is a perfect example of what biodiversity is not, both genetic and species. As far as you can pretty much see in every direction, over there across the road, behind the tree line behind me, it's all soybeans. And the particular farmer that works this land every year only plants soybeans. Every single year, it's the same crop. Now, there's a lot of problems with a lack of biodiversity. One, it breaks down the carbon cycle over time because you're not bringing in a diverse group of plants that different microbes and bugs and organisms can feed on. The other problem with the lack of biodiversity, especially when it comes to species biodiversity, is that you create giant swaths of land where pollinators have a food source for only one short window out of the year. The rest of the time, it becomes a food desert. We already know that we're having issues with bees and other pollinator species basically dying off. We're losing all of our bugs, and bugs serve a very, very important role in the breakdown of dead organic matter into soil, as well as pollinating our plants so that they'll produce the food that we want. A corn stalk has to be pollinated before it will produce corn. An apple tree or an orange tree needs a pollinator before it can form its fruit. Without those pollinators, we lose our main source of food. Now, in terms of ecosystem health, this is one of the unhealthiest ecosystems on planet Earth. And there's a big reason for that. So, let's get into genetic diversity first. These plants right here, I can tell you, have been created by the same company that creates the product Roundup, or glyphosate, if you've heard that term used before. Glyphosate is a herbicide, and what it is used for is to go around and spray all of the fields and kill everything except for the one plant that has been designed to survive Roundup. In this instance, that is a soybean field. Now, the only thing growing in this field, as you can see, is just the soybeans. Now, how does this tie into genetic diversity, or lack thereof? Well, all of these plants have the exact same genome. And the reason is because they had to have the genes inserted into them to be able to survive the Roundup. So basically, you're looking at a field of near clones. If a disease were to come along, maybe a fungus or a bacteria or a virus of some sort, that happens to directly affect the glyphosate-resistant soybean behind me, this entire field would be completely leveled. And every other field in the area that's also growing this particular one soybean is also going to be impacted greatly. In fact, if everyone in the country were only growing one type of soybean, we could see the entire soybean crop for an entire region completely get wiped out from one single disease, as opposed to having large genetic diversity, where all of your soybeans might have slightly different genetic information, slightly different DNA, one might actually survive said disease and continue to produce. Maybe you only lose 40% of your crop instead of 100%, right?
Soybeans are great and all, but what about something that everybody likes, like bananas? Heck, everyone loves bananas. They're great on pancakes and banana bread and even on banana splits. Well, your favorite banana is basically a clone. It's called the Cavendish banana. And all of the bananas are grown in the warmer, wetter areas of the planet, down near the equator on a lot of tropical islands and things like that. And just like the potatoes during the Irish potato famine, the only type of banana that is grown in that entire region, basically on every banana plantation in the world, is the Cavendish banana. And because it's in a hot, damp climate, well, the Cavendish banana is getting a very deadly fungus, very similar to what happened with the potato in the Irish potato famine. And right now, the Cavendish banana is looking to be completely wiped out by this fungus, because there's basically no genetic biodiversity amongst the crops of bananas, which you would get if we were in a normal, real ecosystem. So right now it looks like the Cavendish banana is going to go completely extinct. Now, before you freak out and worry about all of your wonderful, tasty breakfast foods that you happen to eat bananas with, don't worry. There are other species of banana, and one of the solutions that scientists are coming up with is to try and introduce more banana varieties to the American consumer so that plantations will begin growing more varietals of those bananas, just like we do with apples and oranges and so many different other fruits. That way, if a deadly fungus comes along, like the one that's currently wiping out bananas, well, that's only one small portion of the market instead of the entire market. Genetic biodiversity. It's really important.
So a lack of genetic diversity can be very damaging. Another example would be the lack of genetic diversity in some of the royal families of Europe and in Egypt and other countries throughout history. There has always been a, we'll say, preference for royals to marry within their own family. That keeps the royal bloodlines pure, or so they thought. The problem with doing that is that eventually, by having children with your cousins or your sisters or so on and so forth, what will happen is you will get mutations in the genetic code that can be very damaging. And there are several royals throughout history that have been born with several birth defects, oftentimes fatal birth defects.
Like with the royal families, dogs have issues with genetic diversity because so many of the dog breeds have been interbred with their own family members. Genetic mutations begin to occur, and these mutations will affect the long-term health of your favorite canine friend. Golden retrievers are known to have hip dysplasia and joint issues, as well as certain cancers and heart disease, while bulldogs have a long laundry list of health issues, and it can be said that it's pretty irresponsible to buy a purebred bulldog because of all of the genetic mutations that have a major impact on their health and overall enjoyment of life. Once genetic diversity is low enough in a given species, that species can be said to be functionally or genetically extinct, meaning there are so few different genomes in a species that should they continue to mate, mutations and other issues will arise and the species will eventually die off. So for black rhinos, who have around 5,000 total individuals in their global population, well, there's just not enough variety in their genome for the species to be healthy. So should a disease come along, well, it's unlikely that there's enough individuals that would survive that disease, that may have a mutation or something that could help them in that disease. And as they continue to mate with their own brothers and sisters, or, members of a reduced gene pool, well, damaging mutations are more likely. So when we look at species like the black rhino, while they're still here with us, they are functionally extinct and are on their way out in terms of existing on this planet.
So you want to have large genetic diversity, A, because it keeps mistakes in the genetic code from happening. It gives us a nice mix of genes so that should a disease or other factor enter into an environment, there are several different individuals in that population that can survive the changes, thus making sure there are future generations of that particular type of animal. Now, what is the problem with a lack of species biodiversity? Well, I'll get into that in our next spot. Where I'm at right now is the Olathe Prairie Center, and what you have behind me for several acres is basically a restored prairie. This is what Kansas would have looked like as far as the eye could see before we Europeans came to this state and started basically agriculture. And as you can see behind me, there are dozens, if not 100 different species of plants, and that's not an exaggeration. Prairies are biodiversity hotspots, and when you look at a prairie here, you'll see all sorts of different types of flowering plants that have either already put off their flowers early in the spring or are currently putting off their flowers now. There are several different plants behind me that are full of seed pods because their flowers have already been pollinated, while others, like the purple and white asters that we see kind of spread out here, those are those daisies that I've talked to you about, or even some of the yellow goldenrod that hasn't put off their seeds yet, like this goldenrod here has put off its seeds, very similar to a dandelion seed. Point being, there is a wide variety and mix of different plants here. And that's a good thing if you're a pollinator or an insect in general, because that means you have a food source year-round, unlike what you would see in, say, an industrial agriculture farm field, maybe a cornfield or a soybean field or a wheat field. That you have wide swaths of land that only have one type of plant, which means once that particular type of plant is done producing its flower, pollinators have to go, miles sometimes to find the nearest new pollen source. And if you're an insect, that's a long way to travel, and chances are you're going to starve instead of reproduce. This is one of the reasons why we are looking at a potential 70% decline in insect populations worldwide. Now, there's other reasons for that. Part of it is insecticides, but the other reason has to do with the fact that there's these giant pollination deserts for all of our pollinators that we rely on to make our food. So one of the other issues with a lack of biodiversity is that when some of those niches don't get filled, you can get a proliferation of only one type of species. And as I said before, that can cause all sorts of different issues. From a plant side, that means that certain nutrients may not be recycled into the ecosystem, into the soil. It could be that because there's a lack of plant biodiversity, there are fewer food sources for different insects, for different pollinators. There is also an issue when you have a lack of predators. So behind me here is a small pond on this prairie preserve. And on this log, you can count there's about 10 or 15 of the same species of turtle. Now, that many turtles should not be living in the same pond. Eventually what's going to happen, because there's no predators keeping their population down, well, a disease is going to come through at some point, and it's going to spread to all of them. Or these turtles are going to outstrip the food resources that they need to survive and eventually starve off and die. A lot of times what happens with low biodiversity, one particular organism can become dominant in that ecosystem, and as a result crowd out other organisms that might be competing for the same resources, or might be further down on the food chain and is actually a food source for the out of control organism. We've seen this with deer, we've seen this with moose. There is an island called the Isle Royale, and it's up in the northern United States. It's an island pretty much by itself in the middle of one of the Great Lakes. And on it there are moose and wolves, and that's really about it. And when the moose get too large in population, they strip the entire island of all the young growth, and they start starving to death. They die very horrific, painful deaths due to disease and starvation, because the wolves can't keep up after their population. There needs to be something other than just the wolves there to keep their populations down. So were there more predators and a wider variety of predators that could actually eat the moose, well, the ecosystem would stay in balance and you wouldn't have these massive die-offs of suffering animals, which isn't always a great thing. So biodiversity is more than just nutrient cycling, it's also about keeping populations in check. Alright, so I was walking down the path here at the Prairie Center and I noticed this particular spot. And it's a little bit different than all the other spots, and it got me thinking, well, what does this have to do with biodiversity? Well, you look at the spot behind me, it doesn't have nearly the number of flowering plants right now as a lot of the other areas that have the asters and the goldenrod and other things that are blooming right now. And what you see instead is a bunch of plants with seeds on them. Well, those plants were flowering just a few months ago. And now there's a food source ready for mice and rodents and birds and other things that happen to eat those seeds. And in a few months, the asters and the goldenrods and whatever the other flowers are I haven't identified yet, well, those are going to start putting off their seeds, and that will become a food source after this one has been depleted. So this ecosystem can continue to support the organisms that live here year-round. Not just that, but the American beautyberry plant, which is actually just down the road here by that pond with all the turtles that I showed you. Well, there's an American beauty plant down there, and those produce some really hard, beautiful purple berries. Nothing eats them until the very dead of winter. It's the last food source that any of these animals will go for. And because that fruit has a lot of very long-chain sugars, it takes a long time before those sugars ripen or start to break down into simpler sugars that the animals can digest and that taste sweet to your tongue. So come late January, when that's the last food source available, boom, there's something for those organisms in the ecosystem to subsist on. The point I'm driving at here is that biodiversity is incredibly important, not just because it helps all of the different nutrient cycles continue to build healthy soil and continue to make the ecosystem function, but because it provides a steady source of food and nutrition for your larger animals, for the things that you guys would recognize as life, essentially, not just plants and bugs. So, biodiversity, it's really important, man. biodiversity. It's awesome. So I'm out here at Lake Lenexa, and I am in an area which is basically kind of a swamp or a lowland area. And this area has been created essentially as a habitat for the different species of organisms that live in this particular environment. Several species of turtles, muskrats, the blue heron, the great blue heron, which you can obviously see right there, several species of fish and blackbirds and other types of organisms have been specifically adapted to this particular type of environment. And one of the things you will see here are all of the different niches that these particular organisms have developed and essentially engineer different little habitats for the other species in this ecosystem. For instance, the muskrats and turtles tend to follow along the same paths in the shallow water. This creates tunnels or areas where other fish and things can pass into the shallower areas for safety and then venture out into the deeper waters as things get cold. So everything in this ecosystem is in some way, shape, or form filling a niche to support other species. Not necessarily intentionally, but their activity supports other organisms. So biodiversity! Tallgrass prairies are some of the most biodiverse ecosystems on the planet. And they're one of the healthiest ecosystems, the most robust ecosystems on the planet. It's interspersed or intermixed with different species of perennial plants as well as annual plants. And the mixture of these two types of plants means that some will be drawing out more nutrients in the soil for sure, but the perennials, which is most of them, are actually continually adding carbon, nitrogen, and other very important nutrients and minerals into the soil. And if you go to any place that's still a naturally preserved prairie, you will notice that the soil continues to build itself over time. Good ecosystems have good nutrient cycles, and this is largely because of biodiversity. See, you can look at plants and animals and insects as basically nature's chemists, and every single one of these chemists has a different bag of tricks, a different type of nutrient it might be able to generate. For instance, obviously, you, the human, are really good at taking carbohydrates and turning them into fat, which is what your body is creating as your long-term fuel storage. Some plants are really good at storing nitrogen. Daikon radishes are a good example. Radishes will create a big ball underneath the ground that you might want to eat if you're an animal, but basically they create a bunch of different chemicals that are useful for life, different things that have nitrogen and sugars and things in them. And these big bulbs, they sit underneath the ground, and when they die and slowly decay, they return some of the nitrogen and other important compounds into the soil as a slow release, kind of like a slow release fertilizer. Only these types of nitrogen compounds are bioavailable for the creatures that live in the ecosystem. Basically, they're more easily used by life than the synthetic forms that we spray on our fields. The point being is that those radishes or other plants that serve the same purpose are busy taking nitrogen and turning it into compounds that can be used by other plants. This is a support ecosystem that would go in and support other plants that are probably going to draw more nitrogen out of the ground than they would put back in. So the point is, because there are so many different species, dozens if not 100 different species of organisms, of plants living in this area, you have a full nitrogen cycle, a full carbon cycle, a full potassium cycle. All of these different plants are all working together to basically create better and better soil, better and better conditions for each other. You have the exact opposite of, say, like a cornfield. or a soybean field, where only one type of organism is growing in there. That one type of organism draws a certain amount of, say, nitrogen out of the soil, and it's not very good at putting it back. So over time, you get nitrogen depletion in the soil. You get carbon depletion in the soil. So biodiversity is very important in terms of keeping your ecosystems healthy. But it's not just the plants. The insects that all feed off of these different plants are also important for the same reason. When these plants die over the winter, something is going to need to consume their dead flesh, the brown leaves and grasses and everything else that are left behind. Insects go hard at work. They eat up all those long chains of cellulose and break them down so that they can be reused by the next generation of plants and organisms. There are different decomposers that also rely on all of these different species of plants. The same thing is true for the microbes in the soil. The more different microbes in the soil, the better. Some microbes are really good at taking nitrogen from the air and turning it into usable nitrates for the different plants that require nitrogen. Some organisms are really good at breaking down cellulose and other long chains or carbon chains and turning them into usable material. As soon as you start taking more and more organisms out of the ecosystem, some of those niches that those organisms filled in will no longer go filled, and you start to get an unhealthy balance in nutrients in the soil. An unhealthy balance in nutrients in the soil means fewer plants can grow there, and the fewer plants there are, the fewer insects that will be there to go and pollinate them. The fewer insects there are, the fewer birds, the fewer rodents and other organisms that feed on those. So the idea is the more organisms you have, the healthier the ecosystem is. Now, I've mentioned plants, I've mentioned microbes, and I've mentioned insects, but what about animals? Why would it be important to have a wide variety of animals in an ecosystem? Well, put quite simply, they serve a lot of different purposes. For one, insects can't break down all of the dead matter in this field. There are tons and tons and tons, literally tons of plant matter here to be broken down. Large things like bison would come along and munch up all of these things and obviously poop them back out. And their feces would go on to support other organisms that could then use the partially broken down chains of cellulose, which might be in, say, glucose chains or something even simpler than that. Well, they can then start working on those compounds. Animals are really good at re-releasing or putting nitrogen back into the soil. So after they've munched up all that plant material, they pee out urine, which is generally high in urea or ammonia, depending on the species of animal. Both of those put nitrogen back in the soil. The same thing is true for their fecal matter. So animals coming along can help fertilize. But it's not just the fertilization and breaking down of larger chains, it's also their ability to work the soil. They're able to sit there with their big hooves and aerate the soil, basically create holes and different things to allow air in to feed the microbes, to feed the plants, because even plant roots need air. It's not just bison though. All the little different rodents and stuff are really good at going and gathering the fruits and seeds that were produced by these plants and spreading them out so that we can get a nice mix of these things in all different areas, again, to better help the nutrient cycling. Same thing with birds. Birds are really good at eating berries and pooping out their seeds elsewhere. This is why all of a sudden you get poison ivy growing in your yard, even though you never planted poison ivy. Right? Birds will eat the berries, they'll poop out the seeds, and boom, now you have poison ivy. Now, they do a lot more useful stuff for ecosystems than just spreading things that make you itch. But the point is, the more animals you have, the more microbes you have, the more different types of fungi and plants and insects you have, the healthier your ecosystem. And as you start to dwindle down the number of species, the less and less healthy it becomes. The easier those nutrient cycles break down. And you start to find niches that are unfilled. And when a niche goes unfilled, well, eventually you will have collapse of the ecosystem in some way. So biodiversity is incredibly important, not just to ecosystems, but the health of the entire planet.